They are thieves by license, yet heroes by proclamation. These were the words of a Spanish chronicler in the early 1600s, perfectly capturing the double-edged sword of English ambition in the Caribbean. By the mid-16th century, Spain was the undisputed master of the New World. Her treasure fleets, the mighty flotas, sailed from Mexico and Peru, carrying unimaginable wealth across the Caribbean. Billions in silver passed through these waters, a glittering prize that Spain's rivals could not ignore. To our restless, newly Protestant England, this wasn't just an empire, it was an invitation. If Spain claimed God's blessing for its riches, England was ready to deliver God's correction. This set the stage for a new kind of war, fought not on traditional battlefields, but in the uncharted spaces between maps. England's first moves were a blend of commerce and conflict. They called it privateering, essentially. State-sponsored piracy. In 1564, John Hawkins sailed to the Spanish Main, not just to trade, but to challenge Spain's monopoly. The venture ended in disaster at San Juan de Ulua, where the Spanish fleet ambushed and nearly destroyed his ships. But from that fiery defeat rose a figure of vengeance. Hawkins's young protege, Francis Drake, fueled by a thirst for revenge. Drake launched a series of devastating raids between 1572 and 1573. He didn't just attack ships, he struck at the heart of Spain's treasure network, capturing the silver trains on the Isthmus of Panama. To Drake's men, the Caribbean became the Sea of the Cross and the Cutlass. Every Spanish port was a potential target, every raid a rehearsal for something bigger. As one historian put it, Drake read Spain's empire like a book and found its margins wide open for the taking. But England's victories weren't just measured in gold and silver. Every raid, every captured ship, yielded a far more valuable prize: knowledge. They seized maps, charts, and letters. They interrogated captured Spanish pilots, surveyed shipwrecks, and secretly sketched every coastline they encountered. This was the birth of a new kind of warfare, where information was as deadly as a cannonball. In these New English Atlases, one island began to stand out: Jamaica. It was described as fertile, underdefended, and blessed with deep, natural harbors, a jewel just waiting to be pried from Spain's grasp. Back in the candlelit rooms of London, merchants and courtiers whispered of its potential. They called it an island of wood and water, rich for ships, poor in soldiers. Jamaica was becoming more than just a place on a map. It was a dream of geography, a prophecy of conquest waiting to be fulfilled. When peace treaties between England and Spain officially put a stop to privateering, the pirates didn't just disappear. They reinvented themselves. From the scattered crews of many nations emerged a new, fearsome brotherhood, the Buccaneers. We will cover more about the Buccaneers later. However, the Buccaneers at first hunted animals, but out of desperation turned their hunting muskets and cutlasses towards raiding Spanish ships and settlements. They gathered on lawless islands like Tortuga and in havens like Jamaica Port Royal, living by their own brutal code. The Spanish called them filibusteros, a word that dripped with contempt. The English, however, saw them as free men of the sea. Their lives were a chaotic mix of cruelty and a surprising form of democratic brotherhood. They elected their captains, divided their plunder equally, and swore fierce oaths of loyalty and vengeance. Though England officially disowned their actions, English governors secretly courted them, using their violence to chip away at Spanish power. That was hypocritical became when you stop and asked a simple question: who funded them? Queen Elizabeth was an initial, secret investor in the voyage. Key ministers, like the Earl of Leicester and Sir Christopher Hatton, were also shareholders. By the early 1600s, England's strategy in the Caribbean had evolved. It was now a sophisticated network of spies and shadows. Intelligence had become their primary weapon. English agents posed as traders, missionaries, and even shipwrecked sailors to infiltrate Spanish territories. They meticulously gathered reports on garrisons' strengths, the number of cannons in each fort, the depth of harbors, and the loyalties of local populations. A 1624 memorandum submitted to the English Privy Council described Jamaica in tantalizing detail: ill-guarded, wealthy in provisions, and ripe for conquest. Espionage became an art form. Spies in Port Royal and Cartagena sent coded letters back to London, written in invisible lemon juice and hidden within the pages of sermons. The sea itself became a messenger, with coded knots, tied in ropes, and secret notes sealed in drifting bottles. It was a maritime intelligence network that was centuries ahead of its time. For all its grandeur, the Spanish Empire was surprisingly fragile. It was too vast to defend effectively and too proud to adapt to the new, asymmetric warfare waged by the English. Spain's fortresses were imposing but outdated, her treasure fleets powerful but slow. As the historian Michel Rolfe-Trewilot noted, the empire's outward silence concealed its inner breadth. Each English raid exposed another crack in the facade. In 1586, Francis Drake sacked Santo Domingo and Cartagena, two of Spain's most important cities in the New World. In 1595, he struck again, burning Spanish ships in the Canary Islands. Although Drake died that same year near Portobello, Panama, his legend lived on. He had shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility. His daring raids fed the growing English conviction that the Caribbean was destined to change hands. Spain's golden century was tarnishing, one burning port at a time. And what of Jamaica in all this? Long before it earned its infamous title as the wickedest city on earth, Jamaica's Port Royal began as a quiet buccaneer anchorage. English and Dutch ships used Jamaica's southern harbors for repairs, to take on fresh water, and to engage in illicit trade. They often did so with the quiet consent of local Spanish settlers, who found it more profitable to deal with smugglers than to wait for support from their own distant empire. Maybe foolishly and ignorantly so. This created a thriving gray economy, a world of smuggling, rum, and rumor that slowly eroded Spain's control from within. By the 1640s, the future site of Port Royal was already a nest of spies, smugglers, and it was a place where allegiances were fluid and profit was king. So when the English fleet finally arrived in 1655 to claim the island, they found not a fortress ready for a fight, but an opportunity ripe for the taking. The invasion of Jamaica wasn't a sudden act of aggression. It was the final, inevitable chapter in a story that had been written over a century, a script penned by pirates, plotted by spies, and ultimately fulfilled by an empire on the rise. Now let's dive a bit deeper. Now, when you picture the 17th century Caribbean, what comes to mind must now be swashbuckling pirates, buried treasure, and epic sea battles, right? But the real story, the one that's often lost in the romance, is far more complex and fascinating. It's really a tale of empires clashing, of global trade, and of how one nation's attempt to control everything inadvertently created its own worst enemy. Spain, in its quest for absolute power, accidentally unleashed the very forces that would tear its empire apart. In the 16th to 17th century, the Caribbean was the hottest piece of real estate on the planet. England, France, and the Netherlands were all desperate to get a piece of the new world pie. But one giant stood in their way, which was Spain. Spain's claim wasn't just based on military might. It was rooted in a legal and religious foundation laid down over a century earlier. Back in the late 15th century, the Pope issued a decree called the Interceder, which was later solidified by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Essentially, the Pope, the highest moral authority in the Catholic world, drew a line on the map and divided the entire New World between Spain and Portugal. To Spain, this meant that the Americas, and all the incredible wealth within them, belonged to them and them alone, by divine right. Everyone else was an illegal trespasser. Now, this worked fine as long as everyone in Europe was Catholic and respected the Pope's authority. But then came the Protestant Reformation. Nations like England, France, and the Netherlands, the Pope's decree was meaningless. Why should they respect a religious ruling they no longer believed in? This created a fascinating legal gray area. An English sailor attacking a Spanish ship in European waters was a criminal, a pirate. But attacking that same ship in the Caribbean? Well, that was different. They were operating beyond the line, outside the bounds of European peace. Where is the line, you may ask? Well, the line itself was not a single, universally accepted treaty border, but a combination of two imaginary lines, a meridian and a parallel that roughly marked the boundary between European civilization and the colonial. This free-for-all zone led up to the creation of the de facto wars. This refers to a state of conflict that exists in reality, despite the absence of a formal, legal declaration of war. This war persists in the New World, despite a declared state of amity or peace in the Old World. This generated sneaky legal loophole was the key. It allowed governments, like the English Crown, to issue something called a letter of marque. This was basically a license to pirate. It transformed a common bandit into a privateer, a state-sanctioned raider, tasked with disrupting the enemy's trade. Suddenly, attacking Spanish shipping wasn't just profitable, it was a patriotic duty. This legal justification provided the first spark, but it was Spain's own economic policies that would fan that spark into a raging fire. While the legal arguments were important, the real engine driving the rise of piracy was good old-fashioned economics. Spain was obsessed with control. It established a rigid trade monopoly, forcing all goods from its vast American empire to be funneled through a single port. This port was called Seville. It was a designated Spanish port for this transoceanic trade. All ships trading with the Americas were generally required to begin and end their voyages there. This system, run by an organization called the Casa de, was designed to ensure every last piece of silver and every ounce of gold went straight into the Spanish royal treasury. But this created a massive problem. The Spanish colonies were starved for everyday goods, tools, cloth, wine, weapons. Things they needed for daily life were incredibly expensive and in short supply because they could only come from Spain. This created a huge, untapped market for contraband. A French merchant or a Dutch trader could sail to a Spanish colonial port and sell their goods for a fraction of the official price. And the colonists, desperate for supplies, were more than happy to break the law and buy from them. This illegal trade flourished, especially on the fringes of the Spanish Empire. And this brings us to the island of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Here, a strange and rugged community began to form. They were a mix of French, Dutch, and English runaways, shipwrecked sailors, and indentured servants who had escaped their contracts. They survived by hunting the vast herds of feral cattle and pigs that roamed the island. They would smoke the meat on wooden frames called boucans. And from teas, they earned their name the Buccaneers, or These early Buccaneers weren't pirates. They were hunters and traders. They sold smoked meat and hides to passing smugglers, and even to the Spanish colonists themselves who were desperate for supplies. They were the grease in the wheels of the Caribbean's black market economy, a vital, if illegal, part of the colonial ecosystem. They were tough, self-reliant, and masters of their environment. But their peaceful, if illicit, existence was about to come to a violent end. The Spanish authorities, furious about this flagrant violation of their trade monopoly, decided to stamp out the Buccaneers once and for all. But instead of attacking the men directly, they went after their source of livelihood. Spanish soldiers were dispatched across Hispaniola with a simple, brutal order: slaughter all the wild cattle. By destroying the food source, they hoped to starve the Buccaneers out of existence. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. It didn't eliminate the problem, it transformed it. Robbed of their way of life, the now destitute hunters were forced off Hispaniola. They fled to the small, nearby island of Tortuga, a rocky outpost that would soon become the most infamous pirate haven in the world. They were angry, desperate, and they possessed a unique set of skills. They were expert marksmen, accustomed to hardship, and they knew the Caribbean's coastlines, reefs, and currents better than anyone. With nothing left to lose, they took to the sea. The hunters became the hunted's worst nightmare. They turned their long-barreled hunting muskets, once used for cattle, on the crews of Spanish ships. These were not the grand naval battles you see in movies. A small crew of buccaneers in a stolen boat could sneak up on a larger, slower merchant vessel. With a few Willamette shots from their expert marksmen, they could take out the captain, the helmsman, and key officers, causing chaos and forcing a quick surrender. They quickly organized themselves into a loose but effective maritime brotherhood, united by their hatred of Spain. They operated under a simple, brutal philosophy: no peace beyond the line. Backed by rival colonial governors in places like Jamaica, who were happy to unofficially support anyone causing trouble for Spain, the Buccaneers became a decentralized, highly effective naval force. They were no longer just impoverished hunters, they were the terror of the Spanish Main. Every ship they captured, every chest of silver they plundered, was a blow against the Spanish monopoly. But it was more than that. The wealth they stole didn't just enrich themselves. It was funneled back into the economies of England, France, and the Netherlands. The success of the Buccaneers proved that Spain's grip on the New World was not unbreakable. It showed other European powers that there was a fortune to be made by challenging Spanish dominance. This constant raiding achieved two things. First, it drained Spain's resources. The cost of protecting their massive treasure fleet soared. They had to build more warships, fortify their ports, and constantly fend off these relentless attacks. It was a slow but steady bleed of the wealth that was propping up their empire. Second, it provided the perfect cover for their rivals to pursue more ambitious goals. While Spain was busy chasing pirates, England was thinking bigger. The success of the Buccaneers created the opening England had been waiting for. They realized that to truly challenge Spain, they needed more than just sporadic raids. They needed a permanent, strategic base in the heart of the Caribbean, a place to resupply ships, organize larger expeditions, and project power directly into Spain's backyard. Their eyes turned to a large, strategically located island, an island that would become the crown jewel of their own burgeoning empire, Jamaica. The struggle for the seas, initiated by desperate hunter-stern pirates, was now paving the way for a much larger conflict. A land-based struggle for colonial supremacy. For centuries, the Caribbean was Spain's private lake, a world conquered with the cross and the crown. But whispers grew in the taverns of Tortuga, and stolen letters from Cartagena spoke of an island, rich in pasture but poor in soldiers. Jamaica, the privateers, those wolves of the sea, had already done their work. They were the bloody prelude to empire. Their raids teaching England how to read the Caribbean not as an unknown wilderness, but as a map of weaknesses. When the English fleet finally appeared, it wasn't stepping into a mystery, it was fulfilling a prophecy. History holds its breath on certain nights. In the spring of 1655, the horizon of Jamaica darkened, not with storm clouds, but with sails. 38 great ships, rising from the south like ghosts. The people of Villa de la Vega, what we now call Spanish Town, saw them first. The priests rang the church bells. The soldiers loaded muskets that hadn't been fired in years. The governor prayed to saints who had long fallen silent. The omens had been gathering for decades. Sir Francis Drake. Ashes scattered off the coast of Panama. The constant English whispers. The growing sense of vulnerability. Now, the prophecy had shaped timber and cannon, pennants and psalms. An empire of shadows had come to claim its prize. The wind turned. The tide drew in. The wolves had come ashore. This invasion wasn't some accident of piracy, it was policy. In 1654, the leader of England, Oliver Cromwell, a man of iron will and fervent faith, conceived what he called the Western design. His goal was simple and brutal: to break Spain's monopoly in the New World. Officially, it was a holy crusade, England's Protestant sword against Catholic Spain. Unofficially, it was raw hunger for sugar, for gold, and for dominion. Cromwell assembled a massive force. General Robert Venables would command the army, Admiral William Penn, the fleet. Their orders were clear seas Hispaniola, the jewel of the Spanish Caribbean, or any other island that could advance English interests. They set sail from Portsmouth with 38 ships and 3,000 soldiers. But this was no elite fighting force. Many were untrained, unwilling, and already weakened by sickness. They were a motley crew, held together by the promise of plunder and the fear of Cromwell. Their first target, Santo Domingo in Hispaniola, was meant to be a swift, glorious victory. It was a disaster. The assault, launched in April 1655, was a masterclass in failure. It collapsed into chaos and confusion. The Spanish defenders, fighting on their home turf and bolstered by local militia, easily repelled the invaders. Hundreds of Englishmen died under the merciless tropical sun, their bodies left for the vultures. General Venables wrote bitter letters home, blaming cowards and incompetence for the defeat. But Cromwell's orders left no room for a retreat. To sail home empty-handed meant facing public disgrace, or even worse, the Lord Protector's wrath. Defeated and demoralized, Admiral Penn turned the fleet west. They needed a prize, any prize, to save face. And there it was, Jamaica, a land described as being of wood and water. A consolation prize to salvage England's wounded pride. On May 10th, 1655, the English fleet dropped anchor off the southern coast of Jamaica, near a shallow inlet that would one day become the infamous Port Royal. The Spanish garrison was laughably small, numbering barely 300 men against thousands of invaders. The English came ashore in waves, ragged, sunburned, and still haunted by their failure at Hispaniola. But here, they found their courage. They advanced inland, cutting a path through sugar fields and cassava groves. The Spanish resistance was brief, but fierce. Cannon fired from a small fort at what is now Passage Fort, and musket shots cracked through the palm trees, but the numbers were overwhelming. Within days, it was over. The Red Cross of St. George, the flag of England, flew over the island. The Spanish governor, Juan Ramírez de Arellano, had no choice but to flee. He led a trail of settlers and enslaved Africans into the rugged hills, disappearing into the sanctuary of the Blue Mountains. Behind them, the churches of Villa de la Vega smoldered. An anonymous observer wrote, "The Spaniards called upon God, the English upon fortune. Both found silence, but one found victory." The age of the cross was ending in fire and ash, but the story of Jamaica was far from over. The English had seized an island, but they had not yet conquered a people. In the mountains, a new kind of war was just beginning. The Spanish who fled did not simply vanish. They regrouped, waging a guerrilla campaign from the dense, unforgiving wilderness. And they weren't alone. Maroons who had escaped Spanish slavery and forged their own free communities in the hills watched. These men and women knew the land in a way the English never could. Meanwhile, the English soldiers, already weakened by their voyage, fell victim to diseases they had no name for. Dysentery, yellow fever, the bloody flux, and the dry bellyache swept through their ranks. More men died from sickness than from Spanish swords. The island that was meant to be a prize was becoming a graveyard. They had conquered with the compass and the cutlass, but now they had to hold what they had taken. The Spanish crown, meanwhile, wasn't ready to give up its territory. Now that is a story for another time. The legacy of the Taino, the island's original inhabitants, and the fierce spirit of the African Maroons watched and waited. The fall of the cross was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new, more complex, and often violent reckoning. And the world's most notorious pirate city, Port Royal, was about to rise from the ashes. Let me know in the comments what part of this story surprised you the most. Until next time, stay curious.